Okay, everybody. So as I said, this is our first 2018 school year play posit, and it's going to be about direct and indirect objects. I'm going to do a little review, and then we will move on. It shouldn't take too long to actually get the information out, and then maybe do a little bit of practice. So, direct and indirect objects, and also predicate and predicate nominatives, are predicate adjectives and predicate nominatives, are all considered to be complements. So as we read over here, a complement is a word or word group that completes the meaning of the verb. Every sentence has a subject and a verb. Sometimes the subject and the verb can express a complete thought all by themselves. So Adriana swam, the puppy was sleeping, right? Sometimes, however, a sentence needs a complement. My aunt found. So because the sentence by itself doesn't make any sense, it doesn't have those three things that a sentence needs to be a sentence, which is a subject, a predicate, and a complete thought, we need to complete it with some type of complement. And all of the complements are over on the right side of the screen, or at least my right. I don't know how this looks to you when you watch it, but my right over here has complements. All right, so we've already gone over one complement. You don't need to write this down. But subject nominatives and predicate adjectives are complements. They come after linking verbs. Okay, but we are not talking about those yet, but they're in the same group. We've already talked about predicate nominatives. We're not talking about predicate adjectives until we talk about adjectives. But they're all under the same umbrella of complements. And what really makes a complement, the difference between an object and a nominative or a predicate adjective, is the type of verb they come after. So we know that predicate nominatives come after linking verbs, as do predicate adjectives. Objects, specifically direct objects and indirect objects, come after action verbs. Now this says transitive verbs over here. Transitive, as a term, just means it is an action verb that gives its action away to an object. Meaning that, very specifically, transitive action verbs are verbs that are both action verbs and have direct objects. Fairly simple. They're verbs that have direct objects. They're verbs that give their action away to some kind of direct object. All right, a direct object is the first type. It is completing the meaning of a transitive verb. It's a noun or pronoun or a group of words that tells who or what receives the action of a verb. So, a direct object is a noun or pronoun. Right now we're just focused on nouns because that's what we're studying. A noun or pronoun that receives the action of the verb. So, the direct object receives the action of the transitive verb. All right? Very simple definition. So, let's look at some examples, and I'm going to kind of write down ways in which you can find direct objects. So, the first step of finding a direct object is you need to identify the verb. So if you identify the verb and it's a linking verb, you know that you will not have a direct object. If you have an action verb, you know that you could have a direct object. Just because a sentence does not have a direct, or does not have, well, I should rephrase that. Just because a sentence has an action verb does not necessarily mean it will have a direct object. But all sentences that have direct objects will have action verbs. So, for instance, well, actually, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just go through our steps. So, once I've identified the fact that I have an action verb, I now can try to figure out if I have a direct object or not. So, the second step to finding a direct object is, after identifying that I do have an action verb, ask the questions who or what is receiving the action of the verb. So in this particular example, we have my brother bought a model. So we have an action verb, bought. Bought, that is an action. So I've identified the verb as an action verb. That doesn't necessarily mean I will have a direct object, but I could. So now I have to ask my questions. Who or what was bought? Well, a model was. So because that answers the question, who or what was bought. Now, once again, not who was buying, because that's the brother. The subject does the action of the verb. The object receives the action. So who or what is being bought? The model. Jan called somebody for the assignment. Jan is calling. Who or what is being called? Somebody. So somebody represents the direct object. A direct object may be compound. We can have as many direct objects as there are words in the English language, as long as they are all receiving the action of the verb. So did the car have spoked wheels and a spoiler? Who or what did the car have? Wheels and a spoiler. Notice that they're not putting in, adjectives or including the conjunction, just the nouns. She needed glue, paint, and decals for her model. Who or what was needed? Glue, paint, and decals. A direct object can never follow a linking verb because a linking verb does not express action. To give an action away, you have to express action. Linking verbs do not express action, therefore they cannot give away action. All right, before we get off into indirect objects, I want to let you know, there are different ways in which a test will try to trick you on this, so I'm going to set up some examples. So if you take a look at the three sentences down here, I have three sentences and only one of them contains a direct object. Which one of them contains a direct object? So if you said sentence number 1, this one right here, the first one that has a direct object, you are correct. It has an action verb, gave. Who or what is being given? It's it. Oopsie. It is what's being given, so it is my direct object. I gave during the pledge drive. Who or what is being given? We do not know. So this is what we would call an intransitive action verb because it does not give its action away. There's a prepositional phrase after the sentence. Remember, it needs to be a noun or pronoun for it to be a direct object. And then finally on this last one here, I gave quickly. Quickly is an adverb. So it cannot be a direct object because it's not a noun or a pronoun. Also, it does not answer the question who or what is being given. It answers the question how something was given. So indirect objects are another type of complement like direct objects. The indirect object helps complete the meaning of a transitive verb. In a sentence, if a sentence has an indirect object, it must also have a direct object. So you can have sentences that have direct objects without indirect objects, but you can't have sentences that have indirect objects without direct objects. So an indirect object has to have a direct object in the sentence. Also, indirect objects always fall between the transitive verb and the direct object. So that's a pretty big clue. You have the location of where it has to be, and you also have, if there's a sentence that has that does not have a direct object, it's certainly not going to have an indirect object. Also, you know where it's going to be. So let's take a look at some examples. An indirect object is An indirect object is a noun, pronoun, or word that comes from between the verb and the direct object. We already said that. When we're putting it together, it's the third step of finding it. To find indirect objects, you have to ask to or for whom. or to or for what? And those are the questions that you would ask to find an indirect object. So after finding a direct object, you would, it would be in your best interest to see if there's an indirect object in the sentence, and those are the questions that you would ask. So let's take a look at some examples. I gave that problem some thoughts. Who or what did you give? You gave thoughts. To who or for what did you give that thought? For the problem. Dad bought himself some peanuts. Who or what was bought? The peanuts were bought. For whom or to whom were they bought for? They were bought for himself. If the word to or for is used, the nouns, pronouns, or word group following it is part of a prepositional phrase and cannot be part of an indirect object. That's really important. The ship's captain gave orders to the crew. So, once again, if I write this down, it does seem like we have an indirect object here because it answers the question for or who, to or for what, or to or for whom, right? So if I go through my progression, I'd say, oh, I have this verb gave, who or what was given, orders were given, I have a direct object, to who or for whom was the orders given to the crew. So it seems like I have it, but because it's not placed between the verb and the direct object, I do not have an indirect object. What I actually have is a prepositional phrase. So very clear that when you have prepositional phrases at the end of the sentence, the object of that preposition is not an indirect object. The indirect object has to be between the verb and the direct object. And that's it. We will do some practice on this tomorrow. So I do believe that this is a skill that you've gone over before. Hopefully, I've given you some clues as to how better identify these things. And we will practice this tomorrow, and we'll have a quiz on it on Monday.